What's going on, everybody, and welcome to my show, Tracing the Facts. I'm your host, the nonpartisan Puertorican, and today I wanted to talk about Kimberly Guilfoyle and the recent attacks that have been launched against her by the vicious and radicalized left. Now, the reason that Kimberly has undergone attacks is because there happens to be some kind of confusion with the identity that is given to Puerto Ricans. Now, even though they bypass the fact that Kimberly Guilfoyle is half Puerto Rican and half Irish, they focus specifically on the language that defines her mother's heritage. So I decided I want to go ahead and give you guys a short little history lesson on who Kimberly's mother and father are, and give you a broader understanding of the difference between what defines an American and what defines a U.S. citizen in accordance with law, not opinion or speculation. Now, the first thing I wanted to highlight was the fact that Kimberly Guilfoyle's father, Tony Guilfoyle, was born in Ennis, County Clare, Ireland, and immigrated to the United States in 1957 at the age of 20. Now, the father was an Irish immigrant. So that much everybody was able to understand. But then there was problems when her mother's history or her descendants were brought up. Now, the reason I believe that this is important to note is because 50% of Americans don't even know that Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. So then, who is dictating the language that defines what defines a U.S. citizen, and who is able to, through logic, conclusion, and research, able to draw a logical conclusion about the difference between a U.S. citizen and an American? Now, the reason I say this is because there's a lot of language and laws that are presently in place in Puerto Rico that actually causes a confusion about Puerto Rico's status. Now, the language is confusing for those that are not able to follow on what the language is implying. So I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a brief rundown of the Jones-Shafrith law, which is where the confusion begins. Now, for those of you who don't know, Puerto Rico was a U.S. territory in the 1890s during the Spanish-American War, when Spain ceded Puerto Rico to the United States. Now, Puerto Rico remained a U.S. territory from the 1890s all the way up to the 1917, when the Jones-Shafrith Act was signed, collectively making Puerto Ricans United States citizens. And here's the key word: without rescinding their Puerto Rican citizenship. Now ask yourself this: an American only has one form of citizenship, which is an American citizen. Why then, under the Jones-Shafrith Act, are Puerto Ricans allowed to have dual citizenship? Well, it is because of the simple fact that the language that defines Puerto Rico explicitly states that Puerto Rico is a free and independent yet associated state nation with the United States, which means that Puerto Rico was a strategic location for the United States of America. And because of that, because of mutual interest and mutual benefit, we became a strategic point for the United States of America. And in turn, because we also pay federal taxes, America helped Puerto Rico develop its industrial sector. So when you understand, or at least you have a basic comprehension of what it is that embodies an American, then you understand that under the Jones Act, Puerto Ricans are not Americans. You know why? Because Puerto Ricans cannot vote. for the American president while they're in Puerto Rico. The only time that their American status becomes apparent is when they leave Puerto Rico, which is a commonwealth of the U.S. or a free but associated state, and transition to any of the states in the United States. Then after 30 or 60 days of residency, Puerto Ricans are able to vote 100% of the times. But when you look at the language, does it imply that Puerto Ricans are Americans, or does it imply that Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens? Also, what embodies an American then if Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico aren't able to vote until they actually reach a state that is already part of the American Union? You see what I'm saying? So it's all about semantics and it's all about wordplay. And let me tell you, I made this video as a warning to the Democrats, because what a lot of people don't understand is that this year, 2020, is going to be a very important year. And not only that, but the Democrats didn't do well with Puerto Ricans in Florida in 2018, a year after Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico, because they noticed that not only were they being sabotaged by Democratic Mayor Carmen Yulín Cruz of San Juan in Puerto Rico and the rest of her goons out there in Puerto Rico, but also here in the United States, they had absolutely nobody to champion for them. This in turn led to a flux and influx of Puerto Ricans. Now, in 2016, when Donald Trump won the presidency, there was only 380,000 Puerto Ricans in Florida. After Hurricane Maria, when nothing was done to help Puerto Rico rebuild its roads, rebuild its highways, rebuild its bridges, and rebuild its infrastructure, it led to an influx, an exodus of Puerto Ricans going from and relocating from Puerto Rico to predominantly to Florida and other states such as Illinois. What ended up happening was that Puerto Ricans ended up shifting the political influence from what was once traditionally Cuban Americans in Florida to Puerto Ricans. And this is the result of failed policies for Puerto Rico. This is the result of failed help for Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico only received $10 billion in help, even though it was estimated that Puerto Rico had endured more than $130 billion in infrastructural damage. So when we begin to look at all this, we realize that it was a failed policy in Puerto Rico that led to the influx and the exodus of Puerto Ricans from Puerto Rico into Florida, shifting the influence or the voice of predominantly Hispanics from Cubans to Puerto Ricans. And let me tell you, don't be scared, because what a lot of people don't understand is that it was expected that Puerto Ricans were going to vote predominantly in favor of the left after Hurricane Maria, after Carmen Yulín Cruz tried to sabotage Donald Trump, after Democrats in Puerto Rico hid all of the help and all of the food and all of the supplies that was being sent by Donald Trump's administration to Puerto Rico. Where did we find it? Almost a year later, in warehouses, rotting away, in warehouses, exposed to damages, the generators that he sent, in warehouses, the flashlights, in warehouses, the containers of water, in warehouses. So don't think for a second that Puerto Ricans don't understand what is going on. And because the Democrats continue to believe that a racially charged or ethnically charged talking point is going to be the way to a Puerto Rican's heart or a Hispanic American's heart, or generally speaking, any American's heart, that is the reason why in 2018, Puerto Ricans helped decide Florida's election in favor of Rick Scott, Republican, for senator, and Ron DeSantis, Republican, for governor. And the reason this was so highly important in 2018 was because the governor, which could have turned out to be the socialist Andrew Gillum, was going to be choosing the next 3 judges who were going to decide on same-sex marriage, who was going to be deciding on Second Amendment rights, who was going to be deciding the position and role that schools should play in your child's life, and who was going to be deciding on other important issues that could have ultimately and conclusively changed the course of Florida's future. And because of this, Puerto Ricans and predominantly Hispanic, but with a higher flux of Puerto Ricans, ended up going out and voting in favor of Rick Scott and Ron DeSantis. Now, isn't that a surprise? It's not surprising to me because I was telling people in 2017 that if we do not help Puerto Ricans, this was going to lead to an exodus of Puerto Ricans leaving Puerto Rico and going to Florida and then influencing Florida's election. No matter if it was for the left or for the right, politicians had the opportunity to help Puerto Rico. And you know who's the only one that actually went out and visited Puerto Rico 6 times compared to Barack Obama, whom Puerto Ricans love, who only visited Puerto Rico 1 time. Rick Scott visited 6 times. Rick Scott donated $400,000 from his own salary to Puerto Rico. Rick Scott went and tried to get an additional $600 million for Puerto Rico for residential structural. See, Rick Scott was a smart man because he knew that if we didn't fix the structure for the residences, it was going to lead to United States government intervention through the Department of Health in Puerto Rico to shut down the majority of these houses where these people were living with tar mats over their roofs, and then because of homelessness, lead them to exodus into Florida and to exodus into Illinois. Democrats do not stand a chance in 2020 because of the simple reason that they're too caught up with the race-baiting rhetoric, with Black Lives Matter, with the race-baiting rhetoric trying to get illegals health care, with the race-baiting rhetoric of Islamophobia being the norm in the right, with the race-baiting rhetoric and the identity movement mongering and the fear-mongering and the corona pandemic. I just don't see it. The left has absolutely no talking point. And do you know why we know that this is a fact? Well, because of the simple reason that if they had a talking point, they wouldn't be focused on Kimberly Guilfoyle's descendancy and what it is that defines a Puerto Rican. Even if there is a major problem in the United States where 50% of Americans do not know that Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, yet the Democrats continue to push LGBT history in New Jersey, LGBT history in Chicago, and I believe one other state. Where is the history that teaches the contributions of African Americans, the contributions of Hispanic Americans, and the contributions of minorities in general, if that is what they are championing for? They're not championing for anything. The only thing that they're championing for is intersectionality, which is utilizing groups that are traditionally and generationally, even ideologically, out of sync with one another and weaponizing them against both the heterosexual man and a capitalist system in America. You guys tell me what you think about my perspective on this. I want everybody to stay safe, stay informed, and God bless.
Hey, yo, I love when cats think they're bigger than a sumo. That's when I hit them with a little Puerto Rican judo. Oh, you don't know what that is. That's when I say